So, Rolfe Kent, you are the composer of the new film Stan and Ollie, which gives us a behind-the-scenes look at the comedic duo of Laurel and Hardy. First off, I mean, when you were first offered this film, were you a Laurel and Hardy fan? Were you familiar with them at all? Is that part of why you decided to do this?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up with them. Fan is a strong word. It's not like I sort of sought out Laurel and Hardy films over the years, but I certainly grew up with them, so I was extremely familiar with their films. And yeah, so and the theme tune was hardwired into my head. So yeah, very familiar with them. But the real reason for doing it is the director. The director is, I get along so well with John Baird, and he's such an interesting and engaging guy. So when he said, did I want to do it, I left to the chance.
Well, so then I talk a bit about, I guess, there's obviously there are movies out there, there's biographies you can read. What about this film, other than the director, as you stated? I guess, was there something new that you learned about these two that kind of interested you in wanting to tell their story musically?
Yeah, well, firstly, it's a story I had no idea that because I know that Stan Laurel was British, but they're very much part of Hollywood legend. I mean, they to be honest, I live in LA, and I lived just overlooking the Music Box Steps, which is where they were piano movers up and down the step of one of their very famous films. So so I have very much, they were just they were very much part of early Hollywood. And so to learn that they traveled around Britain doing music halls just seems so massively unlikely and totally true. They toured these British theaters in the 50s quite a bit. And it just seemed like a very strange and interesting story. And then, as the writer puts it, the closeness that you always associate between you assume that Laurel and Hardy, they had a career for so many, for decades together. So surely they were close friends. But as the writer points out, their friendship really only turned up when they were traveling around. They became close friends when they were traveling around Britain doing these music hall gigs. And so that's again. So those are two great stories that I'd never heard before. One. That they did this, and secondly, that's where their real sense of kinship came from.
What were your initial ideas for the score like?
I mean, it was a tricky one because you're doing vintage stuff. You're referencing vintage Hollywood, and I love people having a sense of place. You don't want it to be. I mean, you can go all Chariots of Fire on it and do a synth score, but that was wanted to have a sense of place. And yeah, you want it to feel modern and contemporary in a way that it speaks to you, so that it has that emotional impact. So the original ideas, actually, well, the opening titles is pretty close to one of my original ideas. I seem to love swing in the music, so it has that dun, 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 dun. It has that sort of pulse to it. But there was a lot of experimentation, and some ideas went horribly wrong and were thrown out, and some went well. But that's always the case. It's always throw a lot of stuff at the wall and see what sticks.
I got to kind of wonder what that horribly wrong experimentation must have been like. Do you care to? I mean, is there an example of something you could share with us?
No, I mean, when something goes horribly wrong, it's simply that it doesn't really connect with the picture, or it does, but it doesn't do something that it goes completely the opposite direction to what the director wanted. I mean, a good example is the end title sequence. During the end titles, they cut in this footage of the real Laurel and Hardy dancing, and I wrote a piece of music which fit the rhythm exactly. I nailed it, and very happy with myself. Did an ending title piece of music, full orchestral, finished, show it to the director. On the morning before we flew to London to record it, he said, "Yeah, that's not working." And I was going, "Oh my God, what? Okay, what do you want?" And fortunately, my music editor came up with an idea. He said, there's another piece of music in the film. Why don't we try that here and see if that's in the general ballpark? And then I wrote, based on that, I wrote the entire cue, the whole ending title sequence that day, and got on a plane the following day and flew to London to record it. But yeah, so sometimes you miss. And I mean, there's the other thing. I mean, like some of the routines. There are some comic routine elements woven into their narrative, and if you get the rhythm wrong, it's not funny. It's not funny. It doesn't really connect with you. So that's horribly wrong in my book. You have to keep writing until you get it right.
You mentioned trying to create a sense of place and how the period works into the music. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I like to feature in the score was, the original Dance of the Cuckoos tune, that was their theme tune, has this clarinet and it has the bassoon. And I went, that's great. The clarinet is Stan, the bassoon is Ollie. And I was playing with that, and John, the director, said, go further, make the bassoon lower. And so we did that kind of thing. And woodwind, I closely associate woodwind with the sort of sounds that I think of in Harold Lloyd films and Charlie Chaplin films, and sort of those sort of era, actually, and talkies. I mean, and Laurel and Hardy. So leaning on that kind of instrumentation, I mean, it's a bit of a misnomer in a way, because you think that that's period, and yet so much contemporary music like Star Wars is largely derived from Erich von Korngold, who was a composer in film in that era. So you can use the full orchestra. And so we did, a full orchestra, leaning quite a lot on woodwind, and with some modern elements woven in, but not in ways that felt fresh, but not in ways that sort of screwed with the sense of time.
Right. There's a very delicate balance that the film takes. I mean, you have these two comedic legends, right? So obviously there's comedy that needs to be conveyed, but the movie really does focus on their friendship and the sort of emotional relationship the two of them had. Can you talk a bit about, I guess, expressing that in the film?
Yeah, well, that's certainly in music terms, that was, firstly, the performances, just fantastic. So they were great things to work with to start off with. Steve Coogan and John C. Reilly give you a sort of an openness and an open-heartedness to enable you to access these characters. So that is the starting point, and then it's just a question of making them really, pulling the heartstrings and making those, or adding those tensions, those concerns, and orchestrally, I think that's the more modern material. That is, and was actually quite hard, because you get into the groove of writing this fun, sort of whimsical dancing material, and then you have to go to the heart stuff. And that was an interesting and enjoyable challenge. Had to go, backwards and over it several times. One particular cue where Ollie has collapses, and that whole sort of sense of fear and danger was a really hard one to find the right tone, because you'd come out of all this other more whimsical stuff, but now you had to have some gravitas, some weight to it, some sense of high stakes, and got there in the end. But that, I think I think of it as the more modern musical vocabulary. It's still orchestral, but it's doesn't really reference a period in the same way as the other material did.
All right. You mentioned the director being a major reason why you wanted to work on this film. Now, you've worked with a lot of great directors in your career, people like Alexander Payne and Jason Reitman. So talk a little bit about working with Mr. John S. Bard.
He's he's got an energy. He's got the energy of a much younger man. He's so full of energy and ideas, and he's a great storyteller. I mean, he's so full of stories, and so it makes sense that he'd be a great storyteller in film. And he really connected with the characters and had a real affection for Laurel and Hardy, and but he's a very contemporary filmmaker. In discussing how to approach it and we were able to go deep with those conversations because he liked the idea of it being modern but not too modern and not neglecting legacy and that kind of stuff. So that's very much where the score came out of.
Before we go, I wonder, has this movie inspired you to rewatch any Laurel and Hardy movies? Do you have a favorite one of yours?
I am inspired to rewatch them, and yesterday morning I went and rewalked the Music Box steps because it was so fresh in my experience.
Well, Rolfe Kent, thank you so much. Congratulations on the movie. It was a pleasure talking with you once again.
Pleasure talking to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Have a good one.